evolution.
So Lewis Henry Morgan's foundational ideas into the origin and evolution of man, and his views on the origin of the ancient mound-building cultures, would become revolutionary in changing many societal views. Now, E.G. Squires, that I first want to talk about, he was born in Bethlehem, New York, on June 17, 1821. His father, as they mentioned, was a circuit minister in upstate New York in the 1830s. In 1840, he worked as a struggling writer and co-editor of the Hartford Journal. He accepted a position as an editor of the Gazette in Chillicothe, Ohio. And if you know Chillicothe, it's full of mounds and giant earthworks there. To learn, and he learned a lot about these ancient mound-building cultures. So he qualified himself in 1846 as a civil engineer and started to survey these mounds and geometric earthwork structures. By July 1846, Squire and Davis had reportedly opened 80 mounds and recovered over 6,000 artifacts from those mounds. In 1847, Squire and Davis had turned over their report, The Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, to the newly formed Smithsonian Institute that was formed just about a year earlier, where they published it as the very first publication of the Smithsonian. But it didn't take long before they realized that it really had some political and religious implications that this report would have on race policy, on manifest destiny agenda, on religious claims that were being made at that time. So they, E.G. Squires, without Davis, was rehired back by the Smithsonian and asked to spend 6 weeks and go up to the state of New York and to do some survey work. So he pulled in some of the same plats and survey plates that he had and created a new book that now this was going to be more politically correct. And with this book, they even changed the name. Okay, now it's no longer ancient monuments, now it's Aboriginal monuments. That they have always been here, or they migrated across, you know, the sea bridge, you know, at some point in time. And so this was his 1849 book. Well, he complained heavily with the heavy-handed editing of the Smithsonian at the time. So in 1851, he published his own book in Buffalo, New York, using some of the same plates and survey maps. And he called it the Antiquities of New York. I just found that very interesting. Okay, so these men, okay, also came in contact. Okay, Lewis Henry Morgan of Rochester, he searched Squires out and gave his input and insight onto what, you know, was how he viewed these ancient Indian cultures. So within the 4 years of establishing the Smithsonian in 1846, Squire had published 2 books on the ancient mound-building civilizations and spent time with the men who have been credited for advancing social Darwinism to the American culture. His 1848 book, I want to get too bogged down here. So in 1851, Squires would go on to publish his 3rd book on the mounds, which would put him at odds at with the Washington establishment. But instead of doing battle against this prolific writer, who had received much international notoriety, the Smithsonian and the government bought his collection of about 6,000 artifacts that he had. And they gave him an ambassadorship to Nicaragua. And so where he was expected to become a proponent of American expansionism. And so he was shipped off there. But being a prolific writer, he came back and was still causing them problems, really making some pretty strong statements. In 1880, Powell, as director of the Bureau of American Ethnology, began the task of debunking these honored authors. and overthrowing their ideas as to the origin of this lost race theory. Squire reported findings would continue to go against the manifest destiny agenda that were being advanced there in the 1800s. As he would make such statements as this, and this was in his last book, he said, "There is almost positive evidence that the mound builders were an agricultural people, considerably advanced in the arts, possessing great uniformity throughout the whole territory, which they occupied in manners, habits, and religion. A uniformity sufficiently marked to identify them as a single people, having a common origin, a common modes of life, and as a consequence, a common sympathies, if not a common and consolidated government." Battles over these opinions would escalate. Personal attacks would go against Squire's work and would have its toll on his health, as he was committed to an insane asylum for the last 14 years of his life. The man who was credited with some of the most fundamental revolutionary ideas into the science of man was really none other than Lewis Henry Morgan. Now, Morgan was born in Aurora, New York in 1818. He graduated, he graduated from law school in 1840 from Union College, New York. In 1844 to 1881, he moved to Rochester, New York, where he became a well-known attorney, politician, and a very successful businessman, making a small fortune dealing with land rights as an attorney for the railroad and the mining industry. In 1850, Morgan took up comparative studies as he was trying to make a kinship connection between the Indians of India and the American Indian. Now, we know there's no genetic ties there, okay? But that was the connection, and that's what he was advancing. In 1870, he traveled to Great Britain, where he met and corresponded with British evolutionary theorists, Herbert Spencer, Charles Darwin, and Sir John Lubbock. Inspired by these evolutionary theorists, he wrote his most memorable and notable work, Ancient Society, where he came up with what he referred to as the stages of human evolution, that man evolved from savagery to barbarism on to civilization, seeing the Indians as savages, seeing fundamental religionists as barbaric on their progression towards civilization. This scientific theory paved the way for the leading proponents of manifest destiny and provided a rationale for American Indian policy and a blueprint for how to deal with the Native Americans. He was credited for advancing social Darwinism in America and becoming the mentor to John Wesley Powell. Oh, sorry, guys. John Wesley Powell and Frederick Engels and Karl Marx. And so he had a huge influence on people that was really looking to him for mentoring. William DeBye, the biographer and editor of Powell's book, Seeing Things Whole, states, "One of the thinkers in whom Powell drew most heavily was Lewis Henry Morgan, the founder of modern anthropology and, like Powell, a native son of Western New York. John Wesley Powell was an American original. He was the last of the nation's great continental explorers and the first of a new breed of public servant, part scientist, part social reformer, and part institutional builder. What his work and life reveals to us is a way of thinking about the land, water, and society as part of an interconnected whole. As a futuristic thinker, he believed that he was seeing things whole, even to the point of having his brain removed at his death and weighed because he believed that it had evolved to a greater state than the average man. After running the mighty Colorado, Powell became a national folk hero, as the stories of his encounters with the Indians and Mormons became legendary, as he would return to the East to find his professional home in Washington, D.C., where he became a director of the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian, also becoming a director over the U.S. Geological Survey Department, and director over mound building exploration. In these positions, he would have a profound influence on how we view and value these ancient cultures in America. Now this clip right here is, leads us to Powell here. Can we hit the sound?
These views of Native American origins and the underlying evolutionary ideas would become one of the most powerful men in the American scientific community.
He started the Bureau of Geological Surveys for the U.S. government, and then a spin-off from that was the Bureau of American Ethnology, the anthropology surveys. So his entrepreneur ability led to these two institutions within the Smithsonian, supported by the government, and was a great admirer of Morgan. Morgan also, you see, was an entrepreneur who was very successful. I mean, these are two guys that have a lot in common.
Beginning in 1879, Powell as Director of Ethnology and Surveys for the Smithsonian, and Morgan, who became President of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, together created an entirely new direction for the Smithsonian.
There seem to be two traditions at the Smithsonian institutions, and they vie with each other. There's the Lewis Morgan tradition, in which there is a kind of stand on the shoulders of the preceding set of peoples way of looking at life, you know, savagism and semi-barbarism and semi-civilized and civilized and marvelous us. That's one way of looking at life. The other is the tradition that comes from Albert Gallatin, who was really the founder of the Smithsonian Institution, certainly the founder of modern ethnology and anthropology. Gallatin said, no, that's baloney. He called it racism. So there are two traditions. One's linear, and the other is, if not cyclical, respectful.